I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our next speaker, Julia Littell, who is a professor at the Graduate School of Social Work and Social Research at Bryn Mawr College and editor-in-chief of the Campbell Collaboration. Julia's own research focuses on home and community-based services for children and families, methods of research synthesis, and the uses and misuses of research in policy and practice. Julia will be providing one of our training sessions over the next 2 days, and we're extremely honoured that she is with us today. So thank you, Julia.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Paul, and to David and others for organizing this event. I'm thrilled to be here. This is a really exciting day for Campbell and for your center. So I'm looking forward to talking with you later on this afternoon and also to our training sessions in the next couple days. Let's see. So first of all, sort of building on what Paul has said, research synthesis is really important these days. Research reviews help us cope with the increased production of primary studies and information overload. So we're all faced with much more information these days, and we rely on research reviews to help us say what's out there. And research synthesis is a good thing. Combining the results of multiple studies, as Paul has said, provides much more compelling evidence than the result of any single study. And yet we see today that sometimes single studies have an undue influence on policy. So there's more and more emphasis on synthesis for better answers about the state of the science and what we know. And again, this is a good thing because research synthesis also provides us with new opportunities to look at what works for whom, under what conditions. As Paul showed you, results of RCTs vary in different areas, and maybe that's because of differences in population characteristics, settings, treatments, outcomes, study designs. So we can use that natural variation across studies to generate new ideas about what works best for whom and why. Why do results vary across studies? That's not a question that primary studies can answer, but it is one that we can answer in research synthesis. So research synthesis has grown quite a bit over the last few decades. Particularly in biomedicine, we've seen a rise in production of systematic reviews from approximately 11 a day in 2007 to 52 a day in 2013. There are similar patterns in other fields, for example, in ecology and evolution, and I want to show you some data in the social sciences. So this is an analysis that I conducted with a librarian at Bryn Mawr College, showing the number of published systematic reviews and meta-analyses, and reviews that included both, in indexed in PsycInfo from 1990 to 2014. And you can see that at the beginning, the red line is meta-analyses. We've been doing meta-analyses in psychology and management and business for some time, so that there was a small body of work there. But systematic reviews really only came online in the social sciences around the 2000s. And then later we began to see the rise of reviews that included both systematic review methods and meta-analyses. So this looks like a good thing, right? Well, this is the same data. Those bottom 3 lines are the same data in another context. And the other context is the number of reviews indexed in PsycInfo over the same period of time that are not systematic and not meta-analytic. Okay, these are non-systematic reviews, which we sometimes call haphazard reviews. So there's a real demand for research synthesis, but by far, the most common types of research synthesis are not systematic. Same database, another database, same pattern. This is social science database, which indexes 450 journals in the social sciences. So different body of data, same story. Okay, so the practice of research synthesis, the way we're going about it, involves mostly non-systematic reviews that are dominating markets. We also know that reviews that are published as systematic reviews vary quite a bit in their rigor and relevance. This is one of my favorite quotes from Ian Chalmers and colleagues, who said that science is supposed to be cumulative, but scientists only rarely accumulate evidence scientifically. And we can do this. We are doing this. So there are scientific methods of research synthesis. They're available. They're rapidly advancing. The science of research synthesis really relies on what we know, based on logic and evidence, about how research results are reported and disseminated, about sources of bias and error in primary research, about sources of bias and error in the research review process itself, and about effectiveness of various strategies that can be used to minimize bias and error in the review process. Okay, there's a body of literature on that that's very useful, and it's interdisciplinary. This work has been used to generate principles and methods that we use to minimize bias and error at each step in the review process. And that's the process that Paul talked about. That's why we are meticulous, we're transparent, and we follow the research on synthesis. So this is how people think the research review process works, but it's not really this nice. So we think that people collect studies, a lot of data is collected, varying from positive to negative results and lots of things in between, and then research reports are generated based on that data, and at that point there's already some synthesis as research reports are providing aggregates. They're analyzing data statistically, not giving you the raw data, but giving you averages and trends and other analyses. And then based on perhaps technical reports, we have publications that generally contain a smaller amount of the original data, and based on that we have research reviews, right? That's just why research reviews are so popular. It summarizes all that evidence. But the truth is, it doesn't work this way, it works in this way. Oops. So at the first step, we have what's called outcome reporting bias. Then we have publication bias, and then we have evidence that there are further biases in the review process that tilt the results toward positive, statistically significant findings. That's the problem we have to deal with in creating systematic reviews, and that's what we're prepared to do, is to get around these biases. So we know that the dissemination of research results is a biased process. Song and colleagues have conducted systematic reviews on this topic. This is due to selective reporting, publication that confirms favorite theories and tends to overestimate the benefits and underestimate the harms of favored treatments. So at this first step, I want to talk a little bit about each one of these things. There's a huge body of literature on all of these biases, and if you're interested in doing reviews, you really should take a look at this. It's fascinating. But outcome reporting bias means that statistically significant and positive results are more likely to be reported, that is, mentioned at all. And they're more likely to be fully reported. That is, researchers are going to give you the data for those results so that you could use it in a meta-analysis. So these biases occur within studies, and they're not related to the quality of outcomes or the quality of studies. So in a high-quality study that collects a lot of results, some positive, some negative, the positive, significant results are more likely to be reported, even though null and negative results are equally valid. Publication bias. We know that about half of all completed studies are published. And this includes, the Jones et al. Paper includes very large trials in medicine. Very large randomized controlled trials in medicine have a publication rate of about 50%. So that means that half of those RCTs are unpublished. Where are they? They're conducted for government agencies or funders, and they're in somebody's office. Now, publication rates might be even lower in the social sciences. We don't have as good data there, but there's one study, a good cohort study that's now fairly old, showing a publication rate of about 31% in psychology. That's this study by Harris Cooper some time ago. So I'm not concerned about the non-publication of poor quality studies. That doesn't matter. What I'm concerned about is that high-quality studies are often not published. There's a pattern here. Again, the studies with statistically significant positive results are 2 to 3 times more likely to be published than similar, equally valid studies with null or negative results. So again, the likelihood of publication is not driven just by the quality of the study or the value of the information, but by whether or not results are significant and confirm favorite theories. If we're going to get all the evidence, and Paul showed you in that lovely forest plot that there were some studies that found negative results, we need those to be included in a comprehensive systematic review. If we're going to get all the evidence, we must look at high-quality, unpublished studies. And there's more to this. There are other dissemination biases that are well documented, so that studies with significant findings we know are published faster than others. They're cited and reprinted more often, so they're probably much more easy to find, especially if you're searching in English. So these biases are ubiquitous, they're cumulative. I showed you they all lead in the same direction, and that is to inflate certain effect sizes. That leads us to this mess. We know there are some problems now. Sometimes this is called the reproducibility crisis, but Ioannidis, in a very famous paper published in 2005, showed that most published research findings are false. We have problems with current publication practices distorting science, and problems with citation networks further distorting what we know. So that's the evidence about how knowledge is disseminated. The problem for us is that review process, the traditional narrative review process, actually makes this worse. So there are other biases in haphazard reviews. So in reviewing this literature, bias can occur at several stages: when we search for studies, when we decide which studies to include in our systematic review, when we extract data out of those studies, when we analyze that data, and when we synthesize the results. At each of those steps, there's opportunity for bias and error, and let me show you some examples. So if we're searching bibliographic databases, they are largely limited to published studies. So the results of our search are going to be affected by publication bias. When we select studies to be included in a review, we know that from empirical, actually experimental evidence, that trivial properties of studies affect whether or not we recall information in them and how we evaluate that information. For example, studies with memorable titles are more likely to be included in a review, and the results of those studies are more likely to be remembered by the reader than studies with, bland academic titles. So maybe the message is use a snazzy title, but that is trivial. I mean, it shouldn't affect how you evaluate the evidence, but it does. So if I'm selecting studies, I'm inclined to pick the titles that jump out at me, or maybe studies by authors I know or am impressed with. And that kind of selection process is quite haphazard and likely biased. When we extract data from studies, we know that this is a very difficult process, and errors are common. We make mistakes in pulling information out of studies very often. It's a difficult task to do. Initial agreement, even between trained observers, PhD level experts in the field, don't necessarily agree on what a study said. So experimental evidence shows that duplicate extraction, having two people read a report and extract data independently and compare notes, is much more reliable. We want to do that so that we're sure that we're understanding what goes on in the primary studies. And then finally, when we synthesize results of multiple studies, we know that narrative synthesis, just writing a description of what we found, is, again, influenced by trivial properties of studies. It's also much less accurate than meta-analysis. So if I write a narrative synthesis and I tell you I found 10 studies and most of them found that this intervention was effective. Most is some kind of proportion, You don't know, as a reader, how I calculated that, and it's very vague, okay? So what people sometimes do instead is what's called vote counting, and that makes this process a little bit more explicit, but it doesn't consider sample size or heterogeneity. So now I might tell you I found 10 studies, and of them, 6 had positive results, 2 had null results, 2 had negative results. What does that mean? You have no idea what that means. Because the 6 studies could be tiny little studies, and the 2 null or the 2 negative could be the giant RCTs, or the other way around. So vote counting is a really bad thing to do, and meta-analysis is the solution. And Terry's going to do a workshop on meta-analysis on Friday. It's not hard to do, and it's much more accurate. So I've said that bias and error are common at every stage, in reporting research results, in publication, in dissemination, and in reviews. So that's the problem. I'm happy to provide you with lots of more evidence of that if you'd like. So our traditional narrative reviews really are the problem, in my opinion, because they rely on convenient samples of published studies. Those convenient samples are what we get from our database, electronic database at our particular institution. Published studies means it's probably a biased sample. The narrative description is going to be not necessarily accurate, subject to bias. Our cognitive algebra or vote counting is not going to solve that problem, and decision rules are not transparent. So readers do not know how traditional narrative reviews were conducted. They can't judge error and bias. Systematic reviews are designed to deal with these issues. That's why we do them. Okay, they aim to sum up the best available evidence in a way that minimizes error and bias. That's the point. We know a lot about how to do this now. We use explicit, replicable research methods to identify relevant studies and objective techniques to analyze the data from those studies. We develop and follow a predetermined protocol that's published or made public in advance of the review. We treat the review process as a form of research and follow basic steps in the research process. I'll say a lot more about that tomorrow afternoon when we have a workshop on systematic review methods. So systematic reviews, as I said, often involve meta-analysis, but they're not the same thing. A systematic review means that you've gone through all of the steps you can to minimize bias and error at each step in the process. A systematic review, though, might include a narrative synthesis of information if there's not enough to meta-analyze. But it might include multiple meta-analyses. And you know, meta-analysis is a statistical synthesis of results from multiple studies. You need 2 studies to do a meta-analysis. More is a lot better. So a systematic review might or might not include meta-analysis. A larger problem, though, is that a meta-analysis might or might not be based on a systematic review. And in psychology in particular, we're seeing many published meta-analyses that are based on convenient samples of published studies. So it's a bad sample. They're vulnerable to all the same publication and dissemination biases that narrative reviews are. And that's very common. So meta-analysis is a step in getting the balance right. So if I do a meta-analysis of publications, that's a little bit more reliable. Systematic reviews aim to get the balance right. Okay, there are international standards for the conduct and reporting of systematic reviews based on methodological research. These are standards about how to conduct each step in the process. The first set of standards comes from the Cochrane Collaboration. The Cochrane Handbook has gone through a number of iterations, And then in 2012, 2013, Cochrane laid out methodological expectations for Cochrane intervention reviews, very explicit standards. Those standards have been adapted by Campbell, and now there are methodological expectations for Campbell Collaboration intervention reviews. In the US, the Institute of Medicine also laid out explicit standards for systematic reviews, and we have PRISMA, which is a statement on how to report results of systematic reviews and meta-analyses. So these are the big international standards. The good news is that they agree. For the most part, they agree on many issues, especially the steps needed to minimize bias and error in the review process. Now, I showed you earlier the numbers of reviews, systematic reviews, and meta-analyses that have been published, but it's important to tell you that some of those systematic reviews, that is, reviews that were tagged as being systematic reviews in the index, really aren't. They aren't systematic reviews. They're called that, but the international standards that I just showed you are not followed by most peer-reviewed journals. And I did an analysis of systematic reviews published in the social sciences in 2015 and found that, in fact, many of them demonstrated complete lack of awareness of current standards. They didn't mention standards, they didn't follow standards. They demonstrated lack of awareness of basic statistics and content expertise. They included what I call poor excuses for bad practice. That means they looked at a previous systematic review and said, we did it the way they did it. Well, they didn't do it well. So what's happening is we're repeating bad practice when in fact there are good standards out there. Here's a quote from Page and colleagues. An increasing number of systematic reviews are being published. Many are poorly conducted and reported. Strategies are needed to help reduce this avoidable waste in research. So the Campbell Collaboration and the Cochrane Collaboration aim to produce high-quality systematic reviews that will help reduce avoidable waste. Review methods matter. Traditional narrative reviews are haphazard, and we've seen that they can lead to the wrong conclusions. The scientific methods are needed to minimize bias and error in the review process. Just to give you an example of this from my own work, my colleagues and I conducted a review in both the Cochrane and Campbell collaborations of the effects of multisystemic therapy, which is a widely used intervention for families with young people with problems in juvenile delinquency, mental health, and child welfare. And we have found more than 100 published reviews of this literature, haphazard reviews. Most of them conclude that this intervention is more effective than the alternatives. In our systematic review, we find no evidence of that. We find if you cherry-pick results of studies, you could come up with that result. But overall, we find that multisystemic therapy is no more or less effective than alternative treatments. These haphazard reviews in the long run may be hazardous to public health because they overestimate the positive effects of favored interventions and underestimate or ignore potential harmful effects. They minimize or ignore viable alternatives, and they promote ineffective or potentially harmful interventions. We can do much better. So some people say, well, the problem is we have these policy windows. We have windows of opportunity that we have to hit. Policy is a fast-moving train. We need answers that are quick, inexpensive, and accurate. So instead of doing the systematic review, which is labor-intensive and takes time, we have to do it now. And my response to this is pick two. You want quick, inexpensive, accurate. You can have any two you want, but you can't have all three. If you want it quickly and accurately, it's going to cost. To get the experts in at the beginning, to go through the process, it's not going to be cheap. Pick two. But I think Mark Pettigrew actually has a better answer. And that is, oh, really? Policy is a fast-moving train? Really? Okay, it is, but the next train's coming along in 10 minutes. Because important questions endure. Now, I work in child welfare, and we are asking now the same questions that we were asking 30 years ago. The same questions pop up every decade because we haven't developed good answers. So, important questions will endure until we get good answers, answers that withstand the test of time, answers that include all the evidence with replication and debate, and whose interests are served by quick, inexpensive, and inaccurate answers. Who benefits from that? Do you want it haphazard? Do you want it rapid? Do you want it systematic? For policy and practice, we want accurate information, and we know how to get it. It's just not quick or cheap. So that's the value of Campbell Reviews, okay? Campbell Reviews and Cochrane Reviews are based on the science of research synthesis, which has guided efforts to produce comprehensive and accurate evidence summaries. The Campbell Library is all about investing in comprehensive, accurate, systematic reviews for the long haul, so that information is available when policymakers ask for it again. Now, we do need to do some things to respond quickly, and lots of people are talking about ways to rapidly respond based on systematic reviews. So I'm not denying the need for evidence now, but this is the unique value of the Campbell Collaboration, that it produces a library of research synthesis in the social sciences that is there for the long haul, for the public good. So this is where we're going. Better collaboration with policymakers, practitioners, and consumers within and across review-producing organizations like the center that's being launched here today should lead to ongoing improvements in the science and practice of research synthesis. That will produce better evidence to support policy and practice, and our expectation is that that can improve human well-being worldwide. That's the vision of the Campbell Collaboration. Thank you.